call dinner, and our dinner they call supper. And so the evening meal would be in the main house, and we would eat with the family. And so it was very nice. And so one of the first times we were kind of going with John out to the barn where they were shearing these sheep. Barn was, maybe a couple 100 yards away, and I noticed that he took water with him. And that's where I learned that whenever you go anywhere, you ought to take water with you, especially in Australia, but anywhere in the world. You want to have water with you. You can go a while without food, but you got to get real uncomfortable if you don't have water with you. So I've kind of always done that ever since. Everywhere I go, I take water with me. So we go out to the barn where they're shearing the sheep, and he's got a guy that shears, and this big long thing. The tractor runs a belt which turns a bunch of gears, and all these clippers. There's like 6 or 7 of them in a row, and they're all mechanical kind of worm drove things in the shears. And so this guy's shearing the sheep, and so John was teaching us how you take up the pelt of the lamb and you throw it out on this table, and the little second cuts fall down, and how to grade it. And then we put it in this gunny sack bag. It was pretty good size, up to like 450 pounds, because they would charge you by the bag. The railroad would charge you by the bag, and then they would only take up to 450 pounds. So it seemed like that the grandparents, or the parents of this gal that John Lott married, probably did real well back in the 40s, selling wool to the U.S. military for blankets and uniforms, and wool was a big deal back then. And so I think probably the sheep industry in Australia got rich off the United States government and the war thing. And so, but they lived pretty frugally. But you can kind of sense that they'd made some money selling wool, like all the sheep herders down there. So we would go out. We spent about 3 or 4 weeks there, and I came away from there thinking, I do not want to be a farmer. I mean, you're up at 6 o'clock in the morning. We would have a tractor and a trailer, and we'd load up a bunch of parts, and he kind of had a flatbed type truck with a vise on the back of it, and he also had a guy helping him, like a ranch hand. Remember, it was the off season, and so they were going around and doing a lot of repairs and fixing stuff. And so we would, the 4 of us, John Lott and Bill and I, and this ranch hand would, Bill and I go out on the tractor, and John and the guy would go out in the truck, and we'd follow them, and we'd go out to these windmills. Now, I have no idea how many windmills they had, but I'm betting they had 20 at least. And so you can imagine 17,000 acres. I mean, you fence off 100 acres, and that's a pretty good sized chunk of land. We're talking 17,000 acres. So they probably had these things fenced in 1,000-acre pallets, And so when they had the sheep in one of those pallets rotating around for the grass, they had to have water for them. So we were rebuilding some of the windmills, and so they had a cable and a pulley that came off the truck. It was all done by hand. No, had electricity at the house, but nothing outside the house or the compound. And so everything's done by hand. And so you'd pull up these, you'd hook on, you'd disconnect the thing up there at the top, and you'd pull this 1-inch galvanized pipe up and undo it and clamp it and undo it with pipe wrenches and 1-inch couplings, and you do that 5 or 6 times, or however deep the well was, until you got this plunger pump at the bottom out. And then you'd take that off and go over to the truck and rebuild it and put it back on there, and then you'd have to put each one of these back down on the ground again. And so we did that for a few days, and it seemed like we would get 1 or 2 of those done a day, depending on how deep the well was and how many lengths of pipe we had to pull out. And it seems like sometimes when we went out, we would come back for lunch and get a lunch and go out and eat it at the where the ranch hands would eat. There wasn't anybody else there because it was the off season, and so and sometimes we'd take a lunch out there and eat it out there. And so, they'd put in 12-hour days. They were up 6 o'clock, out the door, probably get back about 6 o'clock at night. Kind of real English, eat 8 o'clock at night, supper time. And John Lott was a real smart, educated guy. He'd read a lot. They didn't have TV out there. He listened to the radio, which was really their only information from the outside world. Remember, the United States had landed on the moon in 1969 for the first time, so we were down there in, January of '71, so he was pretty taken back by that, of, just the rocket and all the stuff that had to go into that to make that happen. And he had a radio, probably shortwave or long wave or something, but he couldn't pick up too many stations, but that's where he got his information from. And maybe newspapers, I don't know, they wouldn't get a newspaper every day. I think it was mostly just the radio. And so the other thing that was interesting was it was kind of like stepping back in time, almost like to the late 40s or early 50s. It kind of reminded you of America back then. Things were a bit more wholesome. People kind of, obeyed the law. Everything was baked from scratch. She would make pies and cakes every night for dessert, and everything was made from scratch. And so one of the stories was every week we would go into Narendra, and we'd go with her to get supplies, and just, she was showing us around or whatever, and we'd probably mail a letter or something back to the States. And so she was telling us that she was feeling guilty because she had just started to buy bread in the store instead of making it from scratch at home. And what was funny was the bread in the store looked like it was from home. It was unsliced, brown bread, just like you'd think you'd make it at home. It looked just like that in the store. I think it was still hot when you bought it, and we were just like, couldn't believe it. It was like, you can buy this in the store like this? It's like, wow. And so the other thing was, if you brought your own paper bag, you could save a penny. So they were recycling back then. And so, anyway, she was feeling guilty because she was starting to buy the bread at the store. It seemed like it was about 90 cents, I can't remember, for a loaf. But anyway, that was kind of interesting. So, another time, I told you about the heat in Australia. You wear a long sleeve shirt with a big brim hat, long pants, drink lots of water. You don't go anywhere without water down there. You don't go pick up the mail without water. And so Bill and I were working, replacing some fence posts. You can imagine a fence post in a 17,000 acre sheep station. And so they were wood. Seemed like they were about 8 inches in diameter, logs. They weren't milled or anything. They were just natural logs that they'd cut or done something, and they weren't treated, but there wasn't a lot of water out there for things to dry rot, so I guess they lasted long enough. So anyway, we came back. You had a tractor and a trailer. It was a gray tractor and a gray trailer, and we'd take a bunch of fence posts on there and tools and stuff and go out, and then on that particular case we weren't going too far out. We went across the road. The highway, actually 2-lane road, went through their property, so they had property on both sides of the road, so you'd go across the road and you'd go out into these places, and of course you always got to close the gate behind you, and always gates, and you kind of got to watch where you're going because you could get lost out there. There's so many different ways to go. And so we come back for lunch, and Bill decided he was going to drive back out there, maybe about 20-30 minutes in the tractor, with his shirt off, no hat. Well, the next day he was throwing up sunstroke, and so anyway, he stayed in bed all day, and so I went out by myself and did some fence posts. And so, you know, Australians work hard, and, you know, we were trying to, you know, work hard and not slack off and stuff. So anyway, I ended up doing replacing 8 fence posts that day by myself. And you got a fence post that's, you know, kind of rotted off at the ground or whatever, and so you've got to dig down. I was digging down about 32 to 36 inches on each post, and, you know, getting rid of the old one and putting the new one up there and tacking the wire back on it. Excuse me. So one time I was out there, that day I was by myself, and I remember looking up, and I turned all the way around 360 degrees. All you could see was these, like, 2 fences going over the horizon. It was just like I was the only person on Earth. It was just out in the middle of nowhere. And so another project we had down there, well, one day Bill and John went out on horses and did something. And so John was asking us which one of us was best with horses. And of course I wanted to go, but I'm not very good with horses. And so he picked Bill, and, you know, he should have. And so anyway, it all worked out. But so they went out and drove some cattle somewhere with horses that day. They were gone all day. I don't know what they did, but they probably moved some cattle from one of these 1,000-acre pallets to another one, or 500, or who knows what. But and so another thing we did while we were there was John Lott wanted to pour this concrete slab, and I think it was kind of a place where they load up the sheep or something, and so he wanted to, you know, it seemed like it was pretty good size, like 30, 40 feet by 30 or 40 feet, something like that. And he didn't have any rebar. We were trying to tell him we needed to put rebar in it, but he didn't have any. So anyway, they didn't have pre-mixed concrete, so we had bags of cement, just the powder cement, and then we had sand and gravel at the house in a pile. So we would load several yards, a couple, 2-3 yards at least, on this trailer by hand with shovels. And then we went out there, and Bill and I were just working out there. We probably worked out there 5, 6, 7 days in a row by ourselves, with a lunch out there. And so he probably just gave us that job to get us out of his hair, but and so they had a cement mixer, and it was kind of like a wheelbarrow, but if you could imagine a cement mixer, a little one, on a wheelbarrow, but it was by hand. And so you had to mix it by hand, no electricity out there. And so you mix it by hand, so we'd have to put sand and gravel and cement and mix it up and all that stuff and do it by hand. And of course we had water there because there was not too far away, seemed like, 50 yards or something, was this big metal kind of a trough more than a trough. It was made out of metal, and it was about 8 feet high and probably 15, 20 feet across, and this thing was full of water. So what they do is they'd have a windmill that just pumped all the time, because when the wind was blowing, it was just pumping. And so it pumped this thing full of water, and then there was a pipe that came out to a trough, a long trough, with like a toilet float on the end of it, and that would be water for the sheep and the animals. So there weren't any sheep or animals in that area when we were working there. He'd probably moved them out of there. And so, and then when this thing got full, there was just an overflow pipe that went out and went on the ground, and of course stuff would grow there with water. Had a nice climate. And so, it was hot out there, you know, and so we ended up figuring out pretty quick, every day for lunch we'd go skinny dipping in this tank. And it was kind of hard to get up. It was about 8 feet high, you know. It was metal, corrugated metal on the top, you know, and we had to climb over that thing and be careful and jump in and swim around, and so that was refreshing and kind of fun. And so another time I remember there was, we did a bunch of painting, one thing, and they had a water tower in the complex there, same thing with a windmill, but this tower was up in the air. You know, the tower was up in the air on stilts and stuff. Excuse me, because the windmill would pump it up there, and then it was just gravity fed into the houses. But one day we spent the day just kind of cleaning up around the houses, and they had, you know, lemons and limes and, you know, kind of the Southern California climate, and where you could get water, you could grow anything, and they also had a clay fenced tennis court there on the ranch. Nobody was using it. I think the grandmother used to play tennis. So they had their own tennis court out there, which was pretty interesting. And I also, when we went into town, I got to see a couple of grass tennis courts. I'd never seen that before. So that was kind of fun. But the highlight of the day was in the afternoon. Being Australian and English, they take afternoon tea. And so we're working around out there. Well, pretty soon the lady comes out. She's got this big tray, and she puts it out on the porch, and the dad comes along and sits down, and they invite us to come up and sit on the porch. And so she's serving tea to everybody, and they've got sliced tomatoes and crackers and all kinds of little snacky things, you know, and they take about 20-30 minutes, you know, break, and so anyway, that was really enjoyable to be exposed to that at that age. And you know, Americans were just in too big a hurry to do anything. So it kind of became time for us to go, and we've been there about a month, maybe 3 weeks or so. And so we're getting ready to leave, so we're going to catch the bus to someplace towards Adelaide. And so we just kind of like, well, do we go into town, or where do we catch the bus? And they're like, oh, you just go out here to the road, and they'll come by at a certain time and just pick you up, just wave them down, and they'll pick you up. But okay, so we walked out there and got by the road in time. They knew when the bus was coming by, and so we jumped on the bus and got into some crazy stuff. In the outback, they don't have a lot of bridges because the rivers are dry most of the time. It was flooding that year. And I distinctly remember the bus coming up to the road where the road just went into the river, up like that. And the bus driver said, well, we can't make that. So they literally, of course he knew the route and stuff, but he literally backed up, and we got up on the railroad tracks with a Greyhound bus. and we're driving down the railroad tracks, like that, across this trestle bridge for the train, and got over on the other side down to where we could get back off and go that thing. And I do remember it being a little hair-raising out in the middle of that bridge, that steel bridge, and you're in this Greyhound bus, and it's like the back end was sliding all over the place, you know. And so that was interesting. And we got done with the bus and started hitchhiking again, and we stayed at this, we ran into this kind of resort, again, out in the middle of nowhere, and it was on a lake, so they had water. I'm not for sure, but they might have had a golf course there, which would have been really something else for being out there with the water situation. But of course, the thing I remember was we were sleeping out on this grass, so there was green grass everywhere, and the mosquitoes were like crazy around that lake. So I was wrapped up in a blanket and spent all night hearing the mosquitoes in your ears, and so that seemed like a long night. It didn't seem to matter what you did, you could hear those mosquitoes. So that was pretty crazy. So then another time, we got a ride with some people. They had a pickup truck, and so we got in the back, and it seemed like we were a little farther over towards Adelaide, and several places they didn't have bridges, but they had like a ferry. Now the river wouldn't be very big, maybe as big as a road river or something like that, but there was no way to get across it with a car except this ferry. So like it was just like a flatbed dock that would maybe hold 2 or 3 cars, and you know, they'd pull on this rope and it would go across and unload, and they had the things like that, and you had to get on there. So that was kind of interesting. We did that a couple of times with them, you know. And so we got into Adelaide, and the reason we're going to Adelaide is kind of a whole nother story. So I'm going to flash back to Joe and Bertha Jeffers had owned this house on Coco Isle Circle in Hawaii, outside of Honolulu. And the house next door was being rented by this family from Australia, from Adelaide. And he worked for some kind of tile company that was trying to get tile roofing into the United States. So the company had sent his entire family up to Hawaii for a year or two, maybe a year. And so the year had come and gone, and the family went back, but the dad stayed in Hawaii to continue to try to get this tile business going. And so we met them just by being on Coco Isle Circle, and then as we progressed through what we were doing, they realized, oh, you're coming to Australia, well, you need to come by and see us. And so we end up going to their house, and I ended up having my birthday there on February 18th, 1971. I turned 19. So we spent about a week there. And, you know, we kind of worked a little bit, mowed their yard, and did some stuff. That was the first time I started playing the guitar a little bit, 3 chords, you know. And so that was kind of interesting. And so while we were there, they took us out to some friends that had like a dairy ranch or something out in the country. And so I do remember going out to this dairy ranch, and we kind of all walked across this dairy. I think I had flip-flops on or something, and we're out in this star thistle stuff. So it wasn't exactly a great hike, but, you know, we made do and stuff like that. So that was a lot of fun, and so it was time for us to head north out of Adelaide.